Oh, good afternoon and welcome. I want to start, as we always do, just by acknowledging the lands on which we find ourselves and acknowledge the original custodians of these lands. So I'm right near Kaimai Point, which is on the northern beaches in the southern part, and our office is on the rocks, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to just pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and just acknowledge the lands on which we find ourselves today, and just take a moment to just be really thankful that we can all be here online today. If you'd like to acknowledge the country and the traditional owners in the place that you're coming in from today, please do just pop that in the chat. So thank you so much again for your time today, for joining us here on this 90-minute session. We'll be running together for 4 p.m. and hopefully, if time allows, we'll have a quick break during that time as well. So I invite you now to take a moment, shut off all distractions, take a few deep breaths, check in with the temperature in your feet, and listen to the sounds around you. Just be present and engaged for the session. You'll really get the most out of it. And I'd like you to introduce you next to our speaker, Clint Bertenshaw. Clint will be our speaker today. Clint is the program manager for the Commonwealth programs at the Centre for Volunteering, and as you're about to discover, a wonderful and engaging speaker. Thank you, Clint.
Thanks, Colleen, and welcome all. And what a wonderful way to kick off. Now I've got a lot to live up to, so let's see how we go. This is going to be a bit of an interactive session as well, guys. So what we'll do is there's a lot of people here on the session, which is fantastic, but I like to have, if this was a physical classroom, I like a noisy room. So feel free to go wild in the chat window. Even if I don't respond to it straight away, we'll get to the chats and we'll get you to unmute if you feel comfortable to do so, and talk to everyone, and we'll have a bit of discussion there. As Colleen mentioned, we will have a break about halfway through, just so that if you get a bit sick and tired of hearing my voice, you can go away and clear your ears out, and hopefully come back fresh for some more exciting insights around the idea of virtual volunteering and volunteer motivations. So allow me just to share my screen, and hopefully you all can see that now. And I'm just going to quickly resize my window so I can see all your wonderful faces, those of you who have got their cameras on. So today we are talking about remote flexible roles to match volunteer motivations. And I think this is really important, because if there's one thing we've learned from COVID, is that if we want our programs to be robust, we need to consider different ways to be able to execute our programs. And look, I'll set this up straight away by saying that what we're about to go through is, this is not a silver bullet. I'm not suddenly saying to you all, guys, follow this path, get out there, go and set up a bunch of virtual programs, winning. No. The reality is it's not possible. Virtual works in certain situations. So what we will go through is how to implement virtual volunteer programs. I'll talk about some of the pros and cons and some of the challenges you may face, and we'll discuss, where things might work for you and where things won't work for you. I'll say now, if your primary program is about packing boxes, be it full of food or goods or whatever else, last time I checked, unless of course we've got a lot of money to sit there and do some virtual robots, you're going to need, boots on the ground to get it done. But that doesn't mean we can't look outside of that program and think about some of the ancillary things that we do that we can then turn virtual. So that's what we're going to be going through. All right. A bit more of a breakdown of what we'll learn. We're going to talk volunteer motivations and barriers, and how remote volunteer programs really start to speak to those motivations. And I'm going to show you a couple of graphs from our State of Volunteering report. Just in case you sit there and think, this guy's making it all up, you can go and take a look at the State of Volunteering report, and you can see how the motivations that we speak of, and how remote and virtual roles can really start to bring those together, particularly as we face volunteering in this, I'm going to say loosely, post-COVID world, although I do understand COVID has not disappeared, and who knows what's to come in the future. Speaking of COVID, we're going to talk about the impacts of COVID. What has it done for volunteering? And I'm sure right now you're all got war wounds. to heal. And who knows, we may have more wounds to come. But hopefully, as we've been recovering from the impacts of COVID, we've been setting ourselves up to be a little more resilient if we were to face issues with a pandemic blow up or something else that means that we can't execute our programs the way we have in the past. We'll talk about reviewing, rethinking and redesigning volunteer programs. And this is where I'm going to give a shameless plug to say that over on our Centre for Volunteering website, we've actually got the COVID portal under our resources tab. And there's a couple of seminars that we ran late last year on rethinking and redesigning your program. So I encourage you to, if you can put up with the sound of my voice, taking a bit of a look at those sessions and seeing how you can really start to look at your programs in a little more depth than just virtual volunteering. And then we'll talk virtual volunteering, what it is, how to go about it. I'm a tech nerd, so I can give you all kinds of information on all kinds of apps and software programs and the like. And let me state by saying that we do not endorse any particular program. So if you want to ask me questions and I've played with it, I'm more than happy to share my thoughts on it. But please, any programs I do talk about, any platforms, anything, don't take it as endorsement. Don't come back to me later on and saying, well, you killed my business because nah, I wasn't here and it wasn't me. All right. So why do I know what I'm talking about? Well, I've been a remote worker for about 5 years. In fact, I'm actually coming to you from Tasmania. So for those who haven't done a session with me before, I moved down to Tassie about going on 4.5 years ago, and have for some strange reason continued to work with Sydney organisations since. It's almost like you can take the boy out of Sydney, but you can't get Sydney out of the boy. In that time, I've had to learn how to not only remote work, but how to manage teams remotely. And I had actually been doing that for over 5 years, closer to 10, because even when I was working previously for Optus, we had a number of teams offshore who, when I was a facilitator there, I had to take through training projects, through training, and also managing teams as we brought new call center staff on board. Please do not hold it against me that I train call center staff. I only ever train the good ones. One of the most interesting experiences I've had, and you'll see that photo in the background, you're probably like, why are you showing us your office? Well, that's actually not my office. That is a makeshift radio studio I set up when I got caught in Sydney during COVID. So at the start of COVID, when all the lockdowns hit, I was stuck in Sydney. And now I host a weekly radio show through the community radio station down here. Apart from being their training coordinator, the secretary on their committee, I'm also a host. I'm absolutely in love with Edge Radio, and I didn't want my show to go to waste. So I set up a makeshift studio there, and you're probably like, geez, you had some money there for some gear. Here's the cool part. I did all that on the cheap. Other than that laptop you can see there and the iPad, which was what I brought up with me, all the monitors, the mixer, the headphones, the whole kit and caboodle, that was all beg, steal and borrow type routines, going around to all my friends wherever I could and getting equipment on the cheap, which in the not-for-profit space, in the volunteering space, I understand. It's nice to be able to say we can do all this stuff. It's even nicer when you can do it without having to spend all your funding. And if there's one thing I have been able to do is operate remotely on the smell of an oily rag. So it is definitely possible. Not only did the radio show get to continue, but we also then ran training programs remotely. We actually kicked off a whole new training program on podcasting, all while I was stuck up in Sydney, which continue on today. The best part of all this, folks, is that it has now meant that the studio is more robust. If we were to ever go into a lockdown, if we were to ever end up in a situation where we're unable to be in the physical studio, we can still continue. Our station operates 24/7, and it is 100% volunteer-based, with the exception of our station manager getting paid the smallest amount of money just to show up for 2 days a week. Everyone does it for the love of the game. So I understand the challenges of working with volunteers, who maybe have different levels of skill, to operate remotely, and also those who maybe have the skill but have a high level of apprehension, who maybe think, is it actually worth it? And that's what we're going to incorporate into this discussion today. For a reflection, and also the first opportunity for you guys to speak. So what I want you to do is have a think about volunteer motivations. Normal, everyday kind of stuff. Why do they come to volunteer with us? What are the motivations? Now, I believe we've got a number of Certificate 4 students with us today. You guys should be well adverse into looking at volunteer motivations, and I can also recognise a few different volunteer managers from around the way. You guys should have reflected on volunteer managers plenty of times before. Reflected on volunteer motivations plenty of times before. What I'd like you to do is either pop it into the chat or maybe raise a hand, and let's talk about what the volunteer motivations are. But while you're thinking about that, I want you to also think about, why do they change? Your moment there. As these are coming in through the chat, I'm seeing a few things. We've got career, gain experience to help others, to meet people and solve their loneliness, to support a cause. Perfect. I think you guys have all been reading the Volunteer Management Handbook, which is fantastic. Right, so what I'm not seeing here, though, is why do motivations change? Caring for family, yep, changes to that. Change in health, massive one, particularly of late, yep. COVID, 100%. New opportunities, yep. Life circumstances. Lack of engagement, oh, I like that one. Fantastic. Too much paperwork, I like that as well. And unfortunately, that's a huge one in our sector. Poor volunteer management. Unfortunately, yeah. Might seem too hard, too many checks, training, yep. Lack of recognition, yep. Changes with personal life, perfect. You guys you absolutely nailed it. One of the things you need to be very mindful of is, when you're talking to your volunteers, really getting a good sense of what their motivations are, not just from the time of coming on board with you, but doing the temperature check with them ongoing. Now, I'm not going to turn this session into the Volunteer Management 101 session on how to work with your volunteers. There's other training we can do for that. But when we're looking at changing up our programs to do something so significant like potentially offering virtual volunteering, it's important to understand what the motivations are of our volunteers, both when they first engage with us and then when we move down the track to incorporating these programs, to see if they're actually going to want to stick around. Now, what I always do when it comes to doing anything with technology is I sit there and think, could my mum do it? And if she couldn't, then we know the first thing we're going to have is some issues with understanding, with digital literacy in this case, with being able to actually take it on board and continue to run with it. So the thing to be mindful of there is, it doesn't matter what the motivations for them starting with you are. If this is where you're going and they're just going to be completely adverse to it, you're going to face challenges. The other thing to think about too is what has happened that may get them on board. So they might be a really solid volunteer who loves your organisation, loves everything you do, but then situations change and now they're at that crossroads where it's like, well, can things change for me, or do I have to go elsewhere? Do I have to leave my volunteering? And then that's where you can be sitting there looking at your programs and going, well, maybe there's a better way. I'm being a little bit cryptic, but I'm being cryptic deliberately here because we're about to, first of all, analyze from the State of Volunteering report, motivations and barriers. So these have come straight from the report. And in 2020, I think you guys nailed it. I think you might have all been cheating. You had the State of Volunteering report open. Well done. Good homework. But you can see you pretty much nailed it. To help others, for social connection, to use my skills and experience. There's a top 3. Top 4, to support a cause. These are pretty core reasons why volunteers volunteer. But what are the barriers? In the report, they actually went and spoke to those who are volunteering and those who are not volunteering. The top one, no time. Now, I think in this COVID changing world at the moment, no time is reasonably huge because everyone's situation is constantly adapting and changing. And the idea of volunteers being able to make it to your organisation at a certain point in time and offer a certain quantity of volunteering hours may not be what they used to be. And even the most dedicated volunteer may find the time pressures are causing them all kinds of issues. And for those who aren't volunteering, well, how can we get around that idea of no time? Costs, health reasons. Virtual volunteering may or may not help with costs, depending on how you want to implement it. Health reasons, it certainly may. And that could be depending on the health reasons, of course. But if it's just a case of maybe not wanting to go to a particular location because of the risk of COVID or just generally not feeling like they can leave the house or whatever else, virtual volunteering can certainly help you in that regards. Not sure how, never been asked, not interested in volunteering. Well, I challenge that by not being interested in volunteering. Has the right opportunity come up for them? And we'll talk a little more about that as well. And you can see the others there. Obviously, like I said, virtual volunteering is not going to be a silver bullet, but you may find that you can use this to challenge some of those barriers. And by taking the time to explore this, you may be able to build your volunteer workforce further. Sure, most of you already know this, but just to sort of really put it on a page, how has COVID impacted volunteering? Well, many volunteers were stood down at various points during the pandemic. Just a quick show of hands, who had to stand volunteers down? Yep, for those with the cameras on, I can see a few hands going up. I can see a few virtual hands going up, thumbs up, awesome, great. Love it. I love that. I love how far everyone's advanced with Zoom over the last couple of years. It's fantastic, which actually proves a point. Let me ask another question, just as a side. Everyone pop their hands down and put your hands up if your level of ability for using virtual platforms like Zoom, Teams, and that has increased over the last couple of years. Yeah. I don't think there is anyone who has not suddenly gotten their head around video calls and video collaboration or virtual collaboration. Here's the funny part. I used to work for a telco, as I mentioned, Optus. And the very idea of using, at the time, I think we were using Cisco. You almost had to do training sessions on how to deliver a training session on how to use those platforms. It was nuts. It was absolutely crazy. And the amount of time that you ended up just on the phone to someone because it was just easier. I mean, the old telephone conference calls where you had the dial-in number and the like. You guys remember them? They've always become a thing of the past. They've almost gone the way of the newspaper, if you will, because this is just so much easier, but people were scared to use it. But we were faced with adversity and we were able to meet the challenge. All right, going back to the slide, volunteer demographics have changed as younger volunteers have stepped up. Now, in the State of Volunteering report, there's actually a whole section on youth volunteering. But I think thinking about our youth as not just current volunteers, but also a potential resource for building our workforce, our volunteering workforce is really important at the moment, because with an aging population and with a pandemic that has had a huge impact on people's health, we have lost a lot of volunteers who were potentially the most dedicated, and we're not guaranteeing that they'll come back. So with the youth getting involved and younger volunteers getting involved, that's fantastic. That fills the gap, but it comes with its own challenges. Things like young families, university, work. For those who have retired, it's great. They've got a lot more free time on their hands to get involved in volunteering, and they're available a lot more during your standard 9 to 5 day. But for students, those with young families, the idea of 9 to 5 is nigh on impossible to get them involved. But they want to volunteer. They want to help, going back to the motivations. So you need to start thinking about, well, how can I utilize, tap into that resource and understand that it's going to look and behave a lot differently to what we've experienced. Pretty much the last two are pretty obvious. We've got continued uncertainty. I mean, right now, restrictions are easing. They may die off. They may increase. The next Greek letter in the alphabet could hit us. I don't know. Although I'm starting to think Omicron sounds more like a transformer. Well, if it's anything like the transformer, I'm just waiting for the Decepticons to show up. Sorry, I just completely nerded out, but it's a virtual volunteering session, so I'm allowed. And I mean, the other thing too is with that uncertainty comes the requirements around social distancing and the like. Getting everyone into an office to do office-based work is not necessarily possible. Even at the moment, it could be a real issue depending on the size of your office and what restrictions you've got to adhere to and the like. And that could fluctuate as well. So with all that doom and gloom, what can we do? We start looking at our roles. We start looking at our volunteer programs. We start thinking about, well, we want to build a more sustainable volunteer workforce. And if you haven't already started to look at your programs of late, now's a really good time to do so, because what you want to do is make sure that if we were hit with another, let's assume that the next big pandemic hits in a year's time. It's not COVID, it's, I don't know, something completely else. And we go back into full lockdowns, whose program would die? Whose program would potentially be hindered? Or whose program has actually now gone for a bit of a rethink and a review to stay sustainable moving forward? I want to open up the floor right now. So if you do want to have a chat, put your hand up and I'll get your mic unmuted. But I want to hear some of the stories. I want to hear who was impacted by COVID and what have you done to move forward and make your programs more sustainable. And Kylie, I see your hand up. So feel free to unmute yourself there. Go for
it. Sorry, I'm in the middle of the COVID, so excuse the sexy voice.
No worries at all.
I work for the Sydney Children's Hospitals Foundation, so we have been hit by COVID. We are the fundraising arm of the Children's Hospital, so our events were hit really badly. They were all cancelled during COVID. And going into the office we're still not in the office because we're a children's hospital. So we actually grew, we doubled through COVID, our volunteers. So we just tried to spin and think about trying to keep volunteers engaged. So we did a lot of social things with them. We did Zooms, like a weekly family Zoom. So rather than just them, we invited their families along, and we did trivia nights, which was really fun and got the kids involved. And then once we started getting we could see the end, we started up a virtual volunteer program. So we reached out to the rest of the foundation and realised there's an opportunity as volunteer managers at the moment where everyone in charities are overworked, less staff, more hours. Even though we're working from home, we don't have the commute, so we actually work that commute because we're also passionate. How can we support you? How can our volunteers support you? So we actually target recruited with you guys to have specialist volunteers who understood, like the uni students, they wanted to help. They need to volunteer. Some of them need to volunteer. So we got them to do some research that probably some of the foundation staff wouldn't have the time to do some really heavy research onto people they're about to see or companies or other things, and got their minds moving, got them excited. And as I said, we've doubled our program and we look to probably do that again in the next 18 months. So I just
Fantastic.
trying to think of positive ways, and it seems to be working.
Love it, absolutely love it. And Kylie's touched on different things that they've implemented in the way of roles that the virtual volunteers can do. And in a moment, we're actually going to explore a few other ideas, and they are just ideas. Let your imaginations run wild. Shivani, your hand's up. Feel free to unmute yourself and let's hear from you.
Hi, Clint. So I'm a volunteer manager at a program called Telecross with Australian Red Cross, where we call elderly clients to check on their well-being. Now, we are a call center based environment, and we were running the show through a call center, which was digitized as well. And overnight, we actually had to move from a call center type of an environment to a community-based remote calling, but we were able to manage that. All our volunteers were on board, and we set out. It happened overnight, kind of a thing, where we had to set down a process and tell them, hand out the phones and seeing where people could use their own phones to make the calls. And making the boundaries as we went along as well, because we had to fine-tune the whole process each month, because we are not digitized, we are not automated, so it's a manual heavy load, and I believe this is the time to digitize, but unfortunately, everybody would know some financial lacking can also affect this. So but we were very fortunate. Like, as each month progressed, we found out that these are the few things that we could tweak and we could change. But I think just keeping the volunteers motivated, just checking in on them, as you were mentioning about the dial-in for teleconferences and everything, because our volunteer base is very diverse. Some of them are very digitally savvy, and some don't even have a digital mobile phone as well. So that was something that I, as a coordinator, had to challenge myself. Okay, one session open with just people dialing, one on Zoom, one on Teams. So I was just throwing everything in the works for them to kind of step up and see what we could do. But yeah, there are challenges, but luckily and fortunately, we were able to, and now it's coming up to 2 years that we've had this program remotely running as well.
Well done. That's fantastic. And look, I really appreciate the fact that you've acknowledged the different levels of your volunteer skills with digital access, with digital literacy. And if there's one thing I would say here is, when it goes to introducing programs like this, you can't just rip the Band-Aid off. It'd be nice to say, we're just going to throw everything at it, get it all digital and go nuts. Yeah, that's going to be very painful. You do sometimes have to meet the volunteers at their skill level. And if that means bring them on a journey where, some you get to talk to over Zoom, some you've still got to do over the old phone, work with them and slowly bring them on board. Think about it as far as training goes and the like. And we'll talk more about that, and we can brainstorm some ideas here to help you as well. Okay, great. So as we move forward now with today's session, we're going to start looking at virtual volunteering in a lot more depth. As we do this, I want you to think about your own programs. Just have them in the back of your mind and think about things like the role itself. What's the frequency and the volunteer availability you need for it? That's important because virtual volunteering opens up a whole new realm of how these programs can be conducted. The whole idea of 9 to 5 or 8 to 4 or whatever time your business operates, you can start to almost put that out the window a little bit. The time of day. Now, do you have mission critical activities that are dependent on the time of day? There's no point saying that you need a whole lot of paperwork done by, that needs to go out, say, by lunchtime, and then getting people to work on it at night, potentially. There's a risk there. Thinking about what activities you could do, but will have least risk, but maybe isn't relying on a specific time of day. Skill set required. I'm sure as we progress, a lot of you are going to sit and go, yep, that's all great, well and good, but how am I going to get my volunteers to use that platform, that program, that anything? And let's talk. Let's talk about the challenges you may face and potentially even pick my brain a little bit, put me on the spot and see if we can come up with other ways to tackle it. And the level of supervision, that's an important one as well. I suppose with virtual volunteering comes a level of autonomy, but there is also a way you can manage people virtually. All right. So for those of you who have heard me say the term virtual volunteering over and over again for the best part of this first half hour of the session and gone, what are you actually talking about? Well, there it is in a nutshell, folks. Virtual volunteering or e-volunteering is volunteering that's done remotely and generally online using the technology that we have grown to know and love thanks to COVID, internet-based platforms, cloud-based software. Just to clear things up, when we refer to the cloud, no, we aren't sending data up to the abyss. It's just the magnitude of server farms that they have all over the place where software resides and data resides and the likes of that. And I say all that because depending on the type of organization you are running, and obviously anything I mentioned at this point is not specific to any one organization, you may need to consult with management, with your board, maybe even with your insurance company to find out if there's any requirements you need to have in place around data storage or having people work remotely and all that sort of jazz. At this point, I'm going to set a disclaimer and say, look, I'm not going to offer any legal advice, nor am I going to offer any work health and safety advice or any insurance advice. I'm not qualified in any of that. So when you are considering a virtual volunteering program, it is important that you do speak to specialists in that area. Insurance, well, particularly work health and safety insurance and lost my train of thought there for a second, but insurance and work health and safety, there's plenty of stuff out there at the moment. Plenty of stuff. And as far as the legalities around it, Justice Connect have got plenty of stuff on their side around getting virtual volunteering up and running, purely from what's happened with COVID. So yeah, definitely go and check those guys out and make sure that anything you implement is in line with any legislation you've got to adhere to and any rules and regulation you have within your organisation. All right. Yes, COVID has definitely made virtual volunteering, it's progressed its adoption. And hopefully you guys are here today because you either A, want to know more about it, B, have already started on the virtual volunteering route and you just maybe have some, you want some more ideas or you want to find out how to overcome some challenges, or you're at least thinking about it. Or you just thought it sounded like a really good offering that you wanted to attend, which is also very cool. And it does provide a real opportunity to rethink and redesign volunteer programs. It really does. And look, as a fan of remote working, and obviously I'd have to be having done it for as long as I have, I think it allows businesses in general to really think about what's important. A lot of the work we do, we work in very much a knowledge-based economy. Gone are the days where everyone's standing on a factory line, moving widgets down the chain, and you have to be there to do it. We can now really think about what's important to people to get the most out of people. And sometimes showing up to a fixed location to do work that they could have done from the comfort of their own home, or I'm going to qualify this and say, I don't consider it work from home, work from office. I consider it work from office if you have to, or work from anywhere, depending on how things are set up. I personally, from here down in Tassie, I work from a co-working space. I don't want to work from home. I do like going into a co-working space where I can have all my gear set up, and it's almost like a mindset shift. When I walk through that door, bang, I'm in work mode. And I like that. But I've also got the option too of working from my home if for whatever reason I, need to be at home, one of the kids is sick or whatever the case may be. Or maybe I'm working from the beach and no one actually knows it, because the wonderful thing with modern technology and the internet is that if you know the platforms to use, no one's going to necessarily know where you're actually working from. I've worked from cafes. I have worked from the beach. The amount of times I sit there and take emails just tacked onto the end of my lunch break on a nice summer day looking over the beach in Kingston. It's beautiful. And I'm super productive at that time, because how could you not be, to be fair? All right. Why include virtual volunteering? It's all well and good for me to say, yeah, let's get on this bandwagon, but why should you include virtual volunteering into your volunteering programs? It extends your resources and availability of skills. In essence, it opens up your volunteer workforce to a whole range of skills and people and knowledge that you may not have necessarily been able to target or acquire before, because maybe the way you were advertising your roles or the general consensus around the type of programs you offered gave the impression that you had to be available to show up to location A between this time to do this work. And now you might be looking for someone who's really good at graphic design, who has no interest in coming into your office, but would be more than happy to whip together a graphic design project from wherever. They might also only be available on the end of their working day. They might only be available at 10 p.m. at night when you are well and truly at home, possibly settling in, watching a little bit of last minute Netflix before bed. But these creatives, and I've known many of them, 10 o'clock seems to be when their creative mind kicks in, and they're up until 3 a.m. in the morning designing all sorts of weird and wonderful things. Do you want to miss out on that opportunity, or do you want those people to be available to you? More opportunities for volunteers to get involved, exactly as I explained. I mean, one of the cool things I really love about the radio station I volunteer for is that apart from when I have to show up to do my show, because it's a slotted time slot, I can really help them out anytime I want. I have been known to sit there after a day's work and help them with their member management. I've been known to sit there and go into the studio once everyone's gone and help them rewire something under the desk, because that's what they needed. And even with the show, if I wanted to, I can pre-record it whenever it suits me, as opposed to actually having to go into the physical studio. And that's one of the cool things as well, is we're saying that just because there's a live mic there doesn't mean you necessarily have to go in for it. Pre-record your show. You've got nothing to do on a Thursday evening at between 10 and 12. Awesome. I've called my co-host up and say, hey, guess what we're doing tonight? Record it, send it into the studio, and the job's done. And I've met my volunteering requirement for that particular role. It offers flexibility. There was a perfect example I just gave you then. How much more flexible could I be than to be able to do my show when I feel like it? Reduces barriers and is more inclusive. This is a huge one. There are a lot of people who just maybe can't come into your organization, but they've got plenty of skills and a heap of passion. And by opening up the ways they can volunteer, you are becoming more inclusive. That's to a whole suite of walks of life, be it those who are maybe, living with a mental health issue, who suffer from anxiety around being with other people. Maybe they just like to work, one-on-one with people, as opposed to feeling like they've got to turn it on to come into the office. Maybe those with a disability. Maybe your offices are not the most accessible. But because they can work from their home or from a location they feel comfortable in, which is already set up for their requirements, now they can get involved with you. And that just opens up your potential pool of volunteers greatly. Just on that too, another quick shameless plug. The centre is involved in the inclusive volunteering program. So if that interests you, we actually do run training for how to make volunteer involving organisations more inclusive, totally free. Find out more. My colleague, Alice, she's phenomenal. She's probably forgotten more about inclusion and diversity than I'll learn in my lifetime. She's fantastic to talk to, so highly recommend if that interests you, but it makes you a bit nervous or you've got some apprehensions or just want to ask some questions, please get in touch with us about that. And here's an interesting one. We're all going to watch the bottom line. Virtual volunteering can reduce overhead costs. Here's an interesting question for you all. And if it's controversial or whatever the case may be, feel free not to answer, but who has actually started to look at your offices and gone, do we really need this much bricks and mortar? Or could we downsize? Put your hands up virtually. Yeah, I'm already seeing a few hands going up. Yep. This has actually been an interesting phenomenon on the backs of COVID because we all had to leave our offices. And for some of us, we had massive workspaces. And yeah, on a normal day to day, it was probably pumping in there. A lot of people coming and going, a lot of activity going on. But once we weren't there and we started to get into that situation of people coming back to work in dribs and drabs, or potentially saying, my motivations have changed. I want to continue doing things, but I don't want to do that commute to come in and help you. Or I'm quite happy to sit there and offer you volunteering, but between this time and this time and this time only. Now you get into a real situation where you look at your office and go, do I really need this much space? Do I really need to have 20 desks in here when only 3 people are ever here? Do I really need to have all the networking infrastructure, the super fast high-speed broadband? Do I need to have all these computers here? You start looking at your overhead costs and start thinking about, can I reduce it a little bit? All right. Wow. I'm just taking a look. There's a heap of stuff in the chat here. I know bits of extra information going out to you. We shut down an entire office in 2020 and now a fully remote organisation. Jay, awesome, absolutely awesome. And look, this is not just happening in the volunteering or not-for-profit space. This is happening with corporates as well. One of my last organisations I worked for up in Sydney before I moved down, well, they were a not-for-profit. They were an association, a members association. But I finally convinced the board, do we really need to have an office? We'd moved from a huge office in Parramatta down across from the wharf there to serviced offices. We started off up the top of Parramatta there at Servcorp, moved down to Regis eventually. Then we moved about 3 times within Regis, and each time the size of the office went from reasonable space down to the last office, which I think I've had wardrobes bigger. And that was about the point when I turned around to them and said, guys, do we really need this? We are all primarily working from home. At the time, I'd already moved down to Tasmania. So I'm like, I'm working remotely. One of our staff was looking to move up to Queensland, and our other staff member had no interest in coming into the office because she had 3 different age kids. One of her kids needed a bit of extra assistance. So the ability to just work from home suited. Did we miss a beat? No. When we needed to get together, we either did it over Teams or Zoom, or heaven forbid, if we had to eyeball each other, we did it over a cup of coffee at the coffee shop. And for all that extra money we saved on not having to pay for an office meant that the board was able to pay for our coffee, which was winning, if you ask me. And what you should see on your screen at the moment is just a bit of a word cloud of a range of different roles that could be utilised or could be done virtually. Whole lot of different things here. And most of these are pretty common roles that most volunteer involving organisations would need to consider. There are also some roles here that even if you don't necessarily do them now, opening up a virtual volunteer program actually gives you some avenues to consider these. So having a look at some of them. Membership management. A lot of organisations, particularly membership organisations, really struggle with keeping on top of the member management, or they've got to put in rather expensive membership platforms to handle it. But then there's the little things like being able to sit there and make sure that, you know, you've created the different interests of your members, and you're getting them on the right mailing list for what you're doing, and all the other intricacies that come with keeping your members engaged. Graphic design and record management. Most organisations at some point have a need for a graphic designer, whether it be just to get something interesting out there for social media or a campaign you're running. And along with that, record management. You know, we've all got piles of filing that we either want transcribed digitally or scanned in. There's no reason why someone couldn't sit there with a scanner at home and just scan them in one by one, even if you have to send a scanner to them. Unless, of course, it's one of those huge, massive Canon ones or something like that. That's obviously a little difficult, but those little flatbed scanners that you can pick up from Officeworks, you know, they're not too bad just to have sitting next to the desk as, you know, you take all your old archives and get them to scanned in one by one. And how cool would that be to be able to help an organisation out to do that whilst you sit there and, I don't know, do it off the side of your desk whilst doing other work, or, you know, cooking dinner for the family or whatever the case may be. Social media is a huge one. As social media really continues to just boom and continually changes, this is a great opportunity to tap into youth volunteering. And I say youth because, let's face it, social media is a young person's game. And I say that because it's continually changing. I mean, I remember when Facebook first hit. Oh, heck, I still remember MySpace. I wish MySpace would come back just quietly. But when Facebook first hit, and it was the ants pants, and now we're sitting there with things like TikTok. I don't get TikTok. I'm not dancing while I'm trying to communicate something, but it attracts a different kind of audience. And as we start to look at building our volunteer base, building the volunteers of the future, we're not necessarily going to get to them through MailChimp campaigns. We're going to get to them through the types of tools that they're using. And if that's TikTok, well, guys, you better start putting on your frocks and start practicing your dances, because it's what's going to happen. But we're probably going to need people who actually understand how TikTok work. And I mean, a lot of the role of an influencer, that's come about because they not only get how to communicate in social media, but they understand how the algorithm works. So if you can tap into, even uni kids who are maybe doing a media degree, and sort of say, well, look, you know, this is a great way for you to build a portfolio of, you know, different social media campaigns you run for our organization. But because we're not a corporate paying with, you know, large amounts of money on the line, maybe it gives them a little bit of creative license. So now they feel like, hey, if I do this volunteering for you guys, I get to explore the different tools that are out there and start learning how the algorithm reacts to this kind of post or that kind of post. It's one of the cool things I really like about volunteering, particularly with the radio station, is the fact that we have no money. Our station has no money. So the moment I put my hand up and say, hey, I want to experiment with this, it's almost like I've got creative license to do whatever I like, as long as I don't have to say, can you give me some money to do it? So think about that. We're always trying to watch the bottom line. How can you tap into those motivations of wanting to build skills and develop skill sets that could potentially, for a young person who's maybe at uni at the moment, they may not have a lot of working opportunity, or if they've got working opportunity, they've got their hands tied, and be able to say, well, look, I'll give you a creative license to do whatever you want with social media. Don't embarrass us. Don't sit there and get us into any slander cases or anything like that. But hey, if you want to set up a TikTok or whatever else, or whatever the next thing that comes along is, go nuts. And this is what we'd like to see out of it. And they might actually really enjoy doing that. And look, I've picked on youth, but there could be even, people who are older than that who have just really fallen in love with social media and the way it all works. So let me not be discriminatory there. Consultation. A few people have mentioned how when we were in lockdown, they were still able to manage consults with people, and even things like in-home visits and that through doing things like regular phone calls or Zooms or whatever else. That's a really important one. Volunteering is about the social aspect, and that's something that you could quite easily say to someone, well, look, we just want you to make phone calls from home. It really doesn't matter where you make the phone calls. As long as the phone calls are done, you're achieving your objective. Podcasting, that's something I'm passionate about. A lot of organizations love the idea of podcasts, but they don't have the time to do it. But you could be able to sit there and take on a virtual volunteer to sit there and record audio. Would you believe you can actually record audio remotely? And I'm not talking about recording Zoom, because Zoom's terrible. But there are ways to record audio remotely, do interviews, get them to edit up the audio, the whole lot, and you could have a whole podcast going for your organization. Advisory committees, there's something you can do remotely. Website maintenance, where I don't think I've known an organization who has ever looked at their website and gone, yep, it's exactly what I want it to be, because they all require a level of maintenance. But there's no, a website's stored online. So it always kills me when the person who's doing the web work actually has to come into the office to do it. It's like, seriously, it's counterintuitive if you ask me. The rest you can read. Yeah, I'm not going to sit there and read all those off. And there's plenty more. There are plenty more roles that you could possibly think of. I want you to start thinking about the roles you've currently got and really think about what are the physical limitations to that role. Is there a real reason to have a real person sitting there doing something physical at a set location? And if there is, great, you know that role can't go virtual. But if you've got elements of any role in your volunteer program that maybe just has someone occupying a bum in a seat for no other reason than that's just the way it's always been done, now you've got an opportunity. And then we start thinking about how we go about implementing it and the challenges of implementing it. The first is going to be resistance to change. And that is up and down the ladder, from managers to volunteers and everyone in between. The resistance to change. Humans don't like change. Let's face it. If we could get by without anything changing and everything going along the way it's always been, hunky-dory, fantastic. Problem is, everything around us forces change upon us. Just when you think everything's going swimmingly, oh, look, here's COVID-19, fantastic. And we have to adapt to it. If there's one bit of advice I can give you with change, is it's all about communication with your stakeholders. And you'll actually start to see that over the next couple of slides, communication is massive throughout all this. Forget the technology, forget the learning gaps. You can teach that stuff. But it's imperative that if you want this to be successful, you've got to communicate the benefits, listen to people, understand their challenges, find ways to address the challenges, whatever they may be. Talk about how you're going to address the challenges. Talk, keep people informed via email, chat, text, send a carrier pigeon to them if you need to. Whatever you can do to keep people informed will help with this transition. And most importantly, keep explaining and re-emphasizing the benefits. Be clear on what the benefits are going to be. Be clear on what the benefits are going to be to the organization and to the volunteers. Knowledge of technology and fear of technology is going to be a huge one. We're talking about implementing a program that's based all around tech. But the reality is, if there's one thing COVID has done for us over the last couple of years, is it's sped both technology and user adoption up. I remember when Zoom was rather cumbersome. Heck, no, I remember when Zoom was barely used. And what actually happened, it was quite funny, slight tangent, but it will actually emphasize my point here. Who remembers Skype? Yeah, where's Skype now? Still exists, hasn't disappeared. But remember when you used to say to someone, I'll Skype you? Well, now it's, I'll Zoom you. The reality was Microsoft kind of took their finger off the pulse there, and Skype fell to the wayside, and Zoom found a way to make it so easy for people to connect to one another by sending URL links. Suddenly you could just open up a link in a text message and do it on your phone, or a link in your email and connect via Zoom. The reality is technology has also found, well, due to COVID, technology has also advanced to make it a lot easier. Things like iPads. I could not believe it. My mum was the sort of woman who the idea of using a VCR just about did her head in. And we brought her on that journey. Then DVDs came. Oh my God, the migraine started, my eyebrow started twitching, and I took her through that journey. Then the grandchildren came, and it was like, Mum, would you like to be able to FaceTime with them? Well, I'm not doing that. Trust me. So we go and get her an iPad. Then my mother's on Facebook. I mean, oh my God. I'm sitting there going, this is a woman who struggled with a VCR. But because of the iPad and the way they make accessing apps so easy, next minute she's on social media with her girlfriends. Now that brought a whole nother headache together. And also it used to be quite funny when she'd ring me up and go, Clint, the iPad's broken. It's like, Mum, iPad's not broken. Facebook's not working for you. But that's a different kettle of fish. But this was a woman who honestly, tech and her just never got along. It was kind of funny that she had a son who was a complete tech nerd. But again, it re-emphasizes the point, but sometimes you've just got to take people on the journey because the technology has caught up. It's no longer the 1980s where the idea of being on a computer means you have had to do a computing degree. It's no longer the time when we're sitting in front of DOS terminals having to remember all these random commands to make it do one thing. Everything's gotten easier now. But what it also means is when you are looking at the technology you implement, try and find technology that's user-friendly, that you can support, and that you can take people on the journey with. And if that means you've got to sit there and maybe use a platform, but it's maybe not your favorite platform, but it'll work, then that's something to consider. Time to implement, develop, and manage. Time. Something we'd all like more of and something we're never going to get. But the reality is, you may actually gain some time back because once you've got this implemented and people are up and running and they're able to do volunteering at different times of the day from home, you may be just checking in every so often via various different methods we're going to talk about, you may find that your time is somewhat freed up. The hard part is, yes, there is going to be an investment of time up front. I'd like to say for you that it'll take no time at all and just get it in there. I'd be the biggest liar on the planet because the reality is you're going to have to take the time to meet with people, to consult with them, offer a level of training. And that's even, just before the programs are up and running. But it's like anything. If you invest the time now, it may actually make things a lot easier and better for you down the track. One other piece of advice I'd offer there is this might be a good opportunity to get a volunteer on board who really understands the technology and get them to help roll out the project. It's almost like whenever we've got a project we want to roll out in the corporate space, we tend to hire a project management company. And wouldn't that be lovely if every time we had something we wanted to do, we could outsource it? But here's the cool part. You could probably find a volunteer who's looking for something like this. Find a potentially an IT uni student who wants to do this as part of their portfolio so that when they sit down for their first job, they can actually say, well, not only have I got the degree, but I've also got the work experience to back it up. And this is the program I rolled out for XYZ volunteering organization. We did it on a budget of next to nothing. And look at the results I've gotten. you can't pay for that kind of reference, to be honest with you. Also goes into the whole reward and recognition side of volunteering as well, by actually create them a really good reference to say, this is what they did, this is what they achieved, and how fantastic was it for my organisation. Ticking off yet another motivator for volunteering. Budget. Okay, this is going to be varying depending on what you're implementing. I can't tell you what sort of budget you need to look for. What I did say to you at the start of this session was that I tend to do things on the smell of an oily rag. There are a lot of pieces of software out there that we may already be using, but we're only using a small portion of it. Perfect example, quick virtual show of hands. Who uses the Microsoft Office suite, or more importantly, Office 365? Yeah. I don't even have to sit here and count. I can see that there's a good over half of you are already on that, and that's just for those who are still tuned in. Here's the thing. Office 365 has a lot of functionality. Who's using, for instance, Microsoft Teams with things like Planner built in? Some people, yeah. Who's sitting there going, what? There's a planning function in Microsoft Teams? Who's using task lists? Who's sitting there going, what? Office 365 is more than just Microsoft Word and Outlook? Maybe a few people. The reality is there's a lot of software out there we're already using and paying good money for. What we do is we go and take a look at it and go, well, what function can we use for that? So in a couple of slides' time, we're actually going to talk about some collaboration platforms, and I'll list two major ones. Office 365 and what used to be known as G Suite is now Google Workspaces. Word, Excel, Outlook, email, spreadsheets, and word processing. But then it's also all the additional stuff they have on there. Office has got Teams, and Teams has become, and look, it's not perfect. I mean, certainly for video chats and that Teams is a bit up and down. But as far as collaboration goes, you can suddenly sit there and do a lot of work together, communicate, set up scheduling, set up projects, the whole lot. Have a central repository of project documents, or just documents in general, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole range of things you can do with it, and they're only building more and more functionality into it, but you just have to go into the built-in app store for it and activate. But you now get so much more out of a piece of software you've already been paying for. And I don't know about you guys, but I personally like it when I can make a piece of software work extra hard than when I have to go out there and buy something else. I resent buying extra things. There's also a lot of free stuff out there as well. And by free, I'm not talking, oh, free, but it's pretty crap. I'm talking free. And then if you really want extra functionality, or you do need to go over certain licenses, then you pay for it, but at least you get the trial it out first for an initial project or whatever the case may be. And we've already spoken about the physical requirements of roles. All right, so things to consider. Technological infrastructure. How are you going to set it all up? What are you going to use? The best way to tackle this is to talk to your existing volunteers, or those who you are looking to do the virtual volunteering with. What have they got? Is everyone, look, I can tell you now, a lot of people are already walking around with a really powerful computer in their pocket. Smartphones. Regardless of whether you're in Camp Android or Camp iPhone or iOS, it doesn't matter. There are apps for days, functionality for days. They've all got mobile data on them, or the ability to have mobile data. There is a lot of power there, and you'll be surprised how much people can do just from their phone. I actually spin my father out sometimes. I'll be sitting there at his place when I do go up to Sydney. And I'll leave the back room where I've got a computer set up out there, and I'll sit on the phone while he's sitting there watching movies on Netflix. He's like, what are you doing? I'm like, working. He goes, don't you need to be out in the back room? I'm like, nope. I'm answering emails. I'm responding on platforms like Slack, which I'll talk about shortly. And if I'm researching, particularly if I'm researching for some training I'm putting together, I'm doing it all from the comfort of the lounge, saving documents off, the whole lot. Even apps like Canva, if you're into graphic design, the app is actually really kind of cool to sit there and just use from your phone. And the best part about it, for not-for-profits, I think Canva is still free, and you get this massively powerful graphic design app that allows you to do really great posts for social media and whatnot. Other things to consider: stakeholder training. You're not going to get through this without need to offer up some training, folks. There's no two ways about it. And that training could be formal training right up to just even coaching people along the way. Bits of mentor training, bits of talking to management and explaining, what it is you're doing and why you're doing it and how it's going to work, so on and so forth. Policies, processes, procedures, online safety, work health, and work from home safety. I mentioned it before, and I want to reiterate the point. I can't offer advice on what insurances you need, how implementing a virtual program will impact your organization's policies. But what you need to do is, what was the app? Canva, C-A-N-V-A. What I would suggest at this point is, if you are thinking about a virtual program, check out what insurances you've got, because your volunteers are now going to be off-site. How does that work for you? And also think about, along with the insurances, what do you need to implement as far as working from home safety, or just work health and safety in general. I know, for instance, with our organisation, with the centre, one of the things we all had to update was our working from home checklist, which considered things like the ergonomics of the workstation you were at. That's something that's really important. Now, for most people, I'd say at the moment, suddenly everyone's home office is looking pretty schmick, thanks COVID. And I can pretty comfortably say that because the sales at Officeworks went through the roof. There must be some correlation there. But the reality is you want to make sure that people are set up. And then you might say, yeah, but if they're not set up, what do we do? Do they not volunteer for us? Well, start to consider what sort of limitations you'll have there, what sort of flexibility you have. And then this is also where the budgeting side comes in. How much does it cost to have that volunteer on site versus if all they need is maybe an upgraded chair or something like that? Will that work in with the budget? Insurance, as we mentioned, definitely check it out. I can't stress that enough. You want to make sure your volunteers are sorted. And then your cost to your organisations and to your volunteers. Now, what I mean by that, for the organisation, there are obviously going to be costs to have the volunteers on board. But for the volunteers themselves, if they've had a really low data amount broadband contract, it's probably cost them next to nothing, versus if they need to upgrade it, is there going to be associated costs that they need to be aware of? The key here is just make sure that, you talk to your volunteers, find out what costs they may be up for, and if there's anything you can help them out with. The beauty of it, we're in the type of day and age now where mobile plans, you get so much data for next to nothing. I mean, gone are the days where it used to cost you an arm and a leg every time you accidentally opened up the browser. And internet plans. Most people now, because of streaming services and the like, if they want to keep their Netflix going and the like, have data plans now that are pretty much unlimited. So you don't have to worry about that thing, but it's still worth talking to your volunteers about. Now we get to designing the roles. And much like when you're reviewing any sort of role, you want to start thinking about a couple of different things. Review your existing role. Think about whether or not what you're going to implement is ongoing versus a short-term role or a project, because that's going to then really have an impact as to how much you want to invest in this. If this is a short-term project, you may just try and find volunteers who are already set up, ready to go. If this is going to be a long-term thing, then the journey and the conversation you have could change dramatically, because you want to start bringing on more of your volunteers. You might want to think about, well, there's no point only bringing on 2 volunteers to do this. What if both volunteers fall ill or can't make it in? What are you going to do next? And the skills required. If you're going to get people to do web design, it's no use turning around to the most digitally illiterate person and saying, hi, I want you to update our website. I'll just tell you now, the cost to fix that is going to cost you more than implement the program. End of story. So actually talk to people about what skills they have. Remember, not everything you do remotely has to be technical. As we heard from before, phone outreach program. It was as technical as making a phone call. And you've now got a whole bunch of volunteers able to work with your organisation without the need to have them on site. Research. A lot of people by now are very comfortable with using Dr. Google to look up whatever you need to. And being able to sit there and research and find information and compile it into a document. Right up to more technical roles that would be technical regardless of whether they're on site or not, like data analysis, depending on the level of data, like editing video. You're not just going to ask anyone, regardless of whether they're on site or not, to sit there and punch together a nice short, sharp video for your website. You need someone who can do that anyway. But this is an opportunity for you to sit there and go, well, that's cool. I really like that. I'll actually then get you to do that from home. And now they might feel more inclined to actually take on more volunteer hours, or maybe you're able to attract a volunteer who's got that skill because they don't have to work within a certain time. All right, at this point, I'm just going to open up the chat. And are there any questions before we move forward? Any you want me to recover? Feel free to put your hand up if you want to ask any. Kylie, unmute yourself. I can see your virtual hand up. Go for it. No, all good. No worries. All right, cool. I'm just going to leave that on the screen for a moment. This is also an opportunity for you to put anything in the chat. But there are, I think, I'll be fair, I actually stole this off a document. I can't remember where I got the document from, but I thought this just summed it up perfectly. A couple of quotes there and how to challenge traditional thinking. Really the idea about our service can only be delivered face-to-face. Yeah, no, not true. Technology changes that. Hard to trust what happens online. Yeah, okay, online has its problems, but it's also hard to trust what people do in person too. How have we gotten by around that for so many years? So how do we make it work? All right. I said to you before, communication is absolutely key, and I stand by this. You need to communicate with your people. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Find the platforms that work. There are a magnitude of software out there, but find the platform that's going to get everyone engaged. And if you have to, you may need to almost create little groups of people and how you communicate with them. Those who you only do over phone, maybe those who just want to be on an SMS trail. Some might just prefer email. The trick is, particularly when you're communicating with people at the early stages of implementation, get on their level. Then once they're on a virtual volunteering program, you want to continually communicate with them, ask them how they're doing, check in with them, set goals and objectives. And this is really important. You may not be able to see what they're up to, but you will only build trust if you know that they know exactly what they have to do and they're showing you they're achieving it. Now, there are other sessions we run at the centre around particularly goal setting and setting objectives. But if I can give you one bit of advice, set SMART goals. Something that's specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, I've forgotten exactly what R is, and timely. But someone can throw it in the chat for me. I'll treat this like this is like a podcast. Just put it in the chat for me, and yeah, fantastic. Yeah, realistic. There you go. I just look like an absolute amateur there. But the reality is, set the SMART goals, because then that way people can feel like they have something they've got to strive for. You can check up on them. You can have conversations. It's not about cracking the whip on them. But once you know you've got clear objectives, then the reality of it is that you can start to feel like you can trust them, and they can feel trusted. And that's going to help make the program a lot more successful. Understand and support your volunteers' skill levels. Again, communication. Talk to people. Find out where they're at. Reassure them. Let them know that if maybe you're using a piece of software but you're just trialing because you think it's going to work really well, but let them know it's just a trial. You'll be asking them feedback. You'll be talking to them the whole time to find out how they're going with it. They might really like the software, but they just need a bit of additional training on it. I'll let you know, one of the cool things is with a lot of the apps and the platforms that are out there and how easy it is to put together little tutorial videos now, chances are there's probably some online training you can point them towards. Hey, if you want to just check out how to do that, go and have a look at this video. And heaven forbid, go and have a look at YouTube. There's a video on absolutely just about everything there. And you can suddenly get people more on board. But the most important thing is that you're at least addressing their concerns. And take your time and implement through iteration. I cannot stress this enough. Now, I mentioned before I'm an absolute tech nerd. The funny part is when you go work for any organization, you put your hand up as being the designated tech nerd, you get asked to implement a lot of different things. One thing I've learned over my time through trial and error, through inexperience, through just understanding how people tick over time, is that you can't throw everything at the wall all at once. Take them on a journey. Implement small. Start off, maybe if you're sitting there just wanting to put your toe in the water for virtual volunteering, think of a project, almost like a proof of concept. Talk to a few of your, strong volunteers and say, who'd be keen for this? Get them on board, because now you're going to suddenly build advocates who are going to be like, yeah, this rocked. That was great. And now others will be willing. Don't sit there and go out and spend the money on the most expensive piece of collaboration software like it's going to solve all your volunteer woes. Nope, it will not. In fact, it's probably going to give you heartache and pain, and you're probably going to end up giving yourself a heart attack in the process. Believe me. Nothing is perfect. No piece of software will solve your problems. It's going to take iterations. At Edge, for instance, we've had a couple of different platforms we've utilized, and we've settled on Slack as our communication/collaboration program for the key senior volunteers and the board. But I'll tell you now, as different board members have come on or different committee members have come on, they're not interested in using Slack. So now we have a combination of Slack and, heaven forbid, it almost hurts me to say this, email. We've had to make it work. Slack's still doing really well, don't get me wrong, but we couldn't make it the one size fit all. And that, even before my time, they tried out a bunch of different programs beforehand, and it was just that Slack stuck for the majority of people. So I've been talking about all these different platforms, and I've put a whole bunch of them on there. You're probably already sitting on a lot of this software anyway, or have had some experiences with them, and it's about making them work. And I'm going to make this a bit high level, but in a moment we are going to open up to Q&As. And look, if we run over the 4 o'clock mark, but you're still asking me a bunch of cool questions, I'm happy to stay on. This is where you get to really tickle my motivations as far as talking tech. So feel free to hang on for that if you want to pick my brain. Microsoft Office, most of you have already said that you use it in some form or another, particularly if you're using Office 365, you will have access to a whole suite of tools there, as I mentioned before. Google Workspace is another one. Used to be known as G Suite. It has changed its name. Another competitor to the market that's not as well known is Zoho Workspace. Zoho over the last few years has actually kind of tried to set itself up as the Office 365 competitor. It also does a lot of stuff in the invoicing and finance space as well, which is kind of cool. For collaboration, Microsoft Teams, Slack, or heaven forbid, Facebook Workplace are great ways of communicating with people and sharing documents and the like. Each have got pros and cons. Facebook Workspace, the reason why I put that on there is for those who, and I use the example of my mum again, for someone who was not very technical, she suddenly worked out how to use Facebook well enough. Well, Facebook Workspace is pretty close to the standard Facebook experience. So if you're finding that you've got a bunch of volunteers who can get around using Facebook, but maybe trying to move them over to a platform like Slack, which Slack, for those who don't know, is very much like Microsoft Teams. In fact, Teams was almost Microsoft's reaction to Slack. So it's like a one-stop shop for being able to chat, share documents, a document repository, and you can then plug in different applications to expand its functionality. But yeah, Facebook Workplace could be an option there if they weren't ready to move over to Slack or even Teams. Video chat, well, you guys know most of them by now, and so does the rest of the world, I think, thanks to COVID. I think that the trick is find the one that suits most people. I know the conversation often rides up, well, why don't we use Microsoft Teams? Well, people have had some bad experiences with Teams. It's getting a lot better, but you may find that people fall back on things like Zoom just because they know it and they've gotten used to it. Messaging, there's a whole bunch of them, and I'm sure in our day-to-day lives, we all use different messaging apps. And the beauty of these outside of standard SMS is the fact that you can create groups, which is really cool from a volunteer management perspective of creating groups around the projects you are overseeing. So if you want to check in with Project X, you can then talk to just that group without everyone chiming in. If you want to talk to Project Y, again, you can talk to that group. And there's a heap of them out there. Facebook Messenger is one of the key ones that's used by everyone. Those who aren't on it, actually, I'd even hazard to say those who aren't technically on Facebook probably even have a Messenger account because it just seems to be where everyone's at. But there are other ones like WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, Viber, particularly Signal and Telegram. They've recently got a lot of press during COVID because they're very much encrypted, and it was almost like this big move to try and capture everyone away from Facebook Messenger. They all work the same. Connect to a contact, type whatever you want, send it on. Put a funny GIF and an emoji on there because why not? And project management. Again, there are plenty of platforms out there. Some that are really common being Trello, Asana, Monday.com. They've all got great apps that are on most mobile platforms. But don't be afraid to use something as simple as Microsoft Excel. The amount of projects I've delivered using nothing more than Microsoft Excel and just coloring in the cells like a good old-fashioned Gantt chart works brilliantly. And with Microsoft Office, you can even if you don't have Office itself, you can generally use Office Online. You can collaborate that way and people can access the documents. So this is over to you guys now. We are on the hour, so if you do need to leave, thank you very much for your time. I really do appreciate it. Real quick, I'll just jump forward. For those of you who are doing your certificate for, if you want to see how this aligns to your course, I've just thrown it up on there, and I'm sure Colleen would be more than happy to explain to you in depth where it all maps. I remember those days of having to make sure that all the work you did aligned to your certificate requirements and all that sort of jazz. But yeah, certainly this all works towards your Cert 4. For everyone else who's hanging on here, feel free to raise your hands and we'll treat this almost like Reddit, ask me anything. Yeah, I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you all have now given some or have some food for thought with your volunteering programs and how you can take them virtual or at least have implement parts of it virtually. And yeah, I look forward to potentially hearing some good stories come from this group. I'm sure the centre would love to hear some case studies of this stuff working successfully. I know I would love to read them.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Clint, for your time today. It's been an amazing session. Yeah, and I'm with Jeanette. A lot of it's a bit scary. It's a lot to take on, but thank you. Thank you so much for your time today and for offering your support.